Inflation doesn't arrive with a warning. There's no siren, no alert, no politician stepping forward to admit, "We quietly reduce the value of your paycheck." Instead, it works like fog. It slips in slowly, silently, settling over everything. Food, rent, fuel, even the cost of your own dreams. Most people never notice it happening. They just feel poorer, a little more stressed, a little more uncertain, as if the world is tightening around them, even though they're working the same hours, or sometimes more. And that is the trick. Inflation is not just an economic force, it's a transfer of power. When prices rise faster than wages, wealth flows upward, from ordinary families to institutions that print, control, or lend money. Governments call it policy. Economists call it necessary. But for millions of people living paycheck to paycheck, it feels like a quiet betrayal. A tax you never voted for, a tax you never see on any bill, a tax that hides in the price of bread, in the rent, in the electricity bill, even in the coffee you drink while trying to convince yourself everything is fine. This is the silent tax. And to understand how it steals your wealth, we need to go back, not just years, but centuries, to the moments when kings, emperors, and modern central banks all discovered the same secret. If you control the money supply, you control the people. For most people, inflation feels like simple bad luck. Prices go up, life gets harder, and no one can quite explain why. But behind this fog, there's a mechanism. A predictable pattern repeated across empires, kingdoms, republics, and now modern economies. And this is where Beyond the Coin TV steps in, because throughout history, every major monetary crisis, every silent transfer of wealth has followed the same hidden cycle. Whether it was Rome, the Ottoman Empire, or modern-day America. Whenever money increased, purchasing power decreased. It wasn't fate, it was policy. Governments rarely cut their own spending, so instead they create more money, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes with complex financial language designed to confuse ordinary people. But the outcome is always the same. More money in circulation. The same amount of goods, higher prices for everyone. What makes this so dangerous is not the numbers, it's the psychology. When inflation becomes normal, people stop asking questions. They blame themselves for struggling. They think they're failing, even though the game was rigged long before their paycheck arrived. That's why rulers throughout history preferred inflation over direct taxation. A soldier will resist if you take his gold. But if you reduce the value of that gold, he may never even notice. This quiet erosion of wealth is not an accident. It is one of the oldest political tools on earth. And yet, even today, billions of people do not realize how perfectly it still works. To understand why inflation keeps returning century after century, we have to look beyond the charts, the headlines, and the official explanations. Because the truth is uncomfortable, someone always benefits, and someone always pays. Throughout history, leaders discovered a powerful secret. Controlling money was far more effective than controlling people. If you command the currency, you can reshape behavior without passing a law, raising taxes, or lifting a sword. You simply adjust the value of what people earn, and they adapt without even realizing why. Look at any empire. Rome diluted its silver, Byzantium clipped its coins, revolutionary France flooded the nation with paper money until prices exploded. And today, modern economies expand balance sheets, suppress interest rates, and inject liquidity with silent decisions made in rooms the public never sees. The tools changed, the outcome never did. Ordinary citizens rarely protest inflation. They work harder, cut spending, take second jobs, delay dreams, all while believing the struggle is personal, not systemic. It's the silent genius of the system. People blame themselves instead of the mechanism draining their wealth. This is why inflation remains the perfect political tool. It transfers wealth upward without confrontation, without noise, without accountability. Just slow erosion, quiet enough to ignore, powerful enough to reshape entire societies. At Beyond the Coin TV, we call this the invisible lever of history. Economies rise and fall. Generations prosper or collapse. But the mechanism continues, always humming beneath the surface. Inflation rewards those closest to the money printer and quietly punishes everyone else. If inflation quietly erodes wealth, then the real question becomes, who gains the most when money loses value? History gives us the same answer every time: the people closest to the creation of money. In ancient kingdoms, it was the royal court. In medieval Europe, it was the crown and its favoured merchants. Today, it's governments, major banks, and large institutions that receive new money before anyone else even knows it exists. This phenomenon has a name: the Cantillon effect. When fresh money enters the system, it doesn't spread evenly. It flows first to those with connections, those who borrow cheaply, invest early, and reposition themselves before prices rise. By the time that money reaches ordinary families, the damage is already done. The cost of living has adjusted upward, but wages have not. So the elite gain assets, the middle class loses purchasing power, and the working class shoulders the silent burden. It's a cycle so old that ancient empires mastered it long before economists ever gave it a name. But here's the part most people never realise. Inflation doesn't just rearrange wealth, it reshapes behaviour. When people feel the ground shifting beneath their feet, they become more dependent on those who promise stability. Governments know this, banks know this, and the system uses it to maintain control. At Beyond the Coin TV, we call this the reverse river, wealth flowing upstream, against the current of everyday effort. Because when prices rise faster than paychecks, everyone swims harder, but only a few ever reach the shore. Inflation doesn't just change prices, it changes behaviour. And when behaviour changes, societies change. When people realise their money buys less each year, they start making decisions not based on logic, but based on fear. They stop saving, because what's the point? They spend faster, before prices rise again. They abandon long-term planning, because tomorrow feels unstable. And slowly, without ever noticing the shift, a culture built on growth begins to transform into a culture built on survival. History is filled with examples. In Weimar Germany, families rushed to buy bread the moment they were paid, fearing their money would lose value within hours. In ancient Rome, citizens hoarded foreign coins because they trusted them more than their own. In Latin America, people today often convert paychecks immediately into goods or dollars. Not because they want to, but because experience has taught them what inflation really means. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When a population becomes fearful, they become easier to control. A society distracted by rising costs has little energy left to question deeper systems. A family worried about groceries has no time to think about monetary policy. And a worker, exhausted by 3 jobs, cannot ask who benefits from the silent erosion of their wealth. This is why inflation is more than an economic phenomenon. It is a political force, as old as empires, as subtle as a shadow. At Beyond the Coin TV, we call this the psychology of scarcity. The moment when people stop dreaming about the future and start fighting to survive the present. When inflation becomes a permanent feature of an economy, people begin searching for shelter. Not just physical shelter, financial shelter. Some protect themselves, some fall behind forever. And the divide between these two groups grows wider with every passing year. Throughout history, the wealthy didn't escape inflation because they were smarter. They escaped because they had access to land when everyone else held coins, access to gold when the currency was collapsing, access to businesses and property when wages lost their meaning. And today, access to assets, stocks, real estate, commodities, long before ordinary families can afford to enter the game. This creates a powerful cycle. Those with assets rise, those with only income sink, and inflation acts like a quiet tide, lifting the wealthy higher while pulling everyone else deeper underwater. But here's the darker truth. Inflation doesn't just reward the wealthy, it creates them. When governments expand the money supply, the first recipients of that new money buy assets while prices are still low. They build empires in the shadows of economic chaos. They multiply wealth while the public scrambles to keep up. And once prices finally rise, it's too late. The wealthy are already protected, the middle class is already shrinking, and the working class carries yet another weight on their shoulders. At Beyond the Coin TV, we call this the Great Divergence, a centuries-old pattern where inflation separates societies into winners and losers, long before most people even realise a game is being played. If inflation quietly separates societies, then trust is the glue that keeps those societies from collapsing. But here's the paradox. The more inflation grows, the more trust crumbles. When people begin to doubt the value of their own money, they don't just question prices. They question institutions themselves. They question the government that promised stability. They question the central bank that insisted inflation was transitory. They question the economists who claimed everything was under control. And eventually the doubt spreads further, toward the entire system holding their lives together. History is rich with examples of this unravelling. In the late Roman Empire, citizens lost faith in the denarius long before they lost faith in their leaders. But once the money failed, the institutions followed. In the 1990s, Eastern Europe, collapsing currencies accelerated political upheaval and reshaped nations. And in modern economies, people increasingly turn to alternative stores of value: real estate, commodities, digital assets. Not out of passion, but out of fear that their earnings are no longer safe. Because trust, once broken, rarely returns whole. This is why inflation is far more dangerous than rising prices on a chart. It weakens the social contract, it erodes confidence, it fuels uncertainty. And it opens the door for radical ideas, desperate policies, and systems built on anxiety rather than stability. This moment, when people no longer believe in the foundation beneath them, is what history remembers as the fracture point. Inflation has many faces. For some, it's a slow rise in prices. For others, it's a tightening pressure on daily life. But beneath all the numbers, charts, and political speeches, inflation is ultimately a story about time. Because time is the only currency every human shares equally, and inflation slowly steals it. It steals the hours people spend working just to keep up. It steals the dreams families postpone because plans feel uncertain. It steals the stability previous generations believed they were building. And most of all, it steals the sense of fairness that holds a society together. When the value of money becomes unstable, people lose more than purchasing power. They lose trust in the future. This is why the silent tax has shaped civilizations for thousands of years. It doesn't conquer nations with war. It doesn't overthrow governments with force. Instead, it erodes confidence grain by grain, until the foundation becomes too weak to stand. But history also shows something else. Every period of inflation, no matter how destructive, eventually forces societies to confront the truth about their systems and rebuild, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but always with a clearer understanding of what money truly represents: faith, stability, and the promise of tomorrow. And that is the real story behind inflation. Not the rise of prices, but the rise of awareness. Because the moment people recognise the silent tax for what it truly is the moment they begin to reclaim their future.